Good evening and welcome to the quiet hours. If you are already lying down, already letting the light dim around you, then you are exactly where this story wants you. Settle in, there is nowhere else you need to be tonight. Somewhere on an ordinary afternoon, tens of thousands of years ago, a person kneels beside a river and reaches for a stone. It is nothing, a small motion repeated 1,000 times before, but the edge of that stone is sharper than it looks, and it opens a thin line across the palm of the hand. No one nearby even turns to look. In this world that is not danger, that is simply what happens when a hand meets stone. And yet in the coming days, that single unremarkable moment will decide whether this person lives to see the next season. Because in a world with no medicine, no antiseptic, and no understanding of what a wound truly carries inside it, the smallest mistake was never really small at all. Picture her for a moment, this one person among many, because it helps to hold on to someone real before the story widens. She is perhaps 20 years old, though no one is counting years the way we do. Her hands are already rough with the particular calluses of someone who has spent a decade preparing hides, cracking marrow bones, and gathering roots from frozen ground. She works at the edge of a river that will one day have a different name, in a landscape that has not yet decided whether it belongs to forest or to ice. When the stone slips and opens her palm, she does what anyone in her position would do. She presses the wound shut with the heel of her other hand, waits for the sting to fade, and goes back to her task, because there is no reason yet to think of this as anything more than an inconvenience. The blood slows. The light shifts toward evening. She walks back toward the others, carrying what she came for, and the cut on her hand is already quietly becoming something else. What she cannot know, what no one around her could possibly know, is that her skin was never simply a wrapping for her body. It was the only wall standing between her and a world thick with organisms built for exactly this opportunity. The evidence for what happens next does not come from any single record, because no one was writing anything down. It comes instead from something more patient and more honest than memory. It comes from bone, across thousands of excavated skeletons, from the ice fields of the Alps to the river valleys of ancient Europe. Researchers have learned to read a particular kind of testimony written directly into the human skeleton. A testimony of infection that spread, of bone that reacted, of a body that fought something it could not name, and more often than we would like to imagine lost. This is the story of that danger. Not war, not famine, not famine, not the sweeping collapse of an empire, but something smaller and in some ways more unsettling. A story about how for nearly the entire span of human existence, the greatest threat to a person's life was not a predator in the dark or a rival tribe across the valley. It was their own body turning against a wound too small to seem worth mentioning. A splinter, a scrape, a tooth left aching too long. In the hours and days ahead, we will follow several of these ordinary catastrophes: the broken leg that stranded someone a group could no longer wait for, the birth that went wrong on a day that began like any other, and the two remarkable individuals whose remains, discovered thousands of years after their deaths, told us more about how fragile early human life really was than almost any other evidence we have. One of them lay frozen in an alpine glacier for over 5,000 years before a pair of hikers found him. The other was a Neanderthal man whose bones carried the marks of an injury so severe that by every reasonable measure he should never have survived it at all. And yet he did for years, which tells its own quiet and remarkable story about who was willing to care for him. Before we walk further into that world, I want to say something simple because it matters to me. If this is the kind of history you come looking for, the real kind told slowly and without theatrics, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps this kind of storytelling keep finding the people who want it. And if you have a moment, I would love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what drew you to a story like this one. I read every single one, even the late ones, especially the late ones. Now let yourself get comfortable, because we're about to go back further than almost any story reaches, to a time when survival was not measured in armies or harvests, but in something as small and as human as a single unhealed cut. To understand why a scratch could become a death sentence, you first have to understand what the human body was actually working with tens of thousands of years ago, and what it was working without. There were no clean instruments, no way to see the microscopic world doing its damage, no word yet for infection, only the visible frightening evidence of it, the heat rising from a wound, the swelling, the smell that everyone in a group would have recognized, even without name for what caused it. The immune system itself was in a very real sense the only doctor anyone had, and it was working blind, reacting to invaders. It could not identify using tools. It had been refining since long before anyone stood upright at all. What makes this part of history worth telling, gently rather than with alarm, is what it reveals about the people living through it. They were not careless. They were not ignorant in the way we sometimes imagine ancient people to be. Evidence from sites across ancient Europe and Asia shows deliberate wound care plant matter, with likely antiseptic properties pressed against injuries, as bindings made from hide and fibre. Even early evidence of what looks very much like intentional cleaning of a wound before infection could take hold. Scholars still debate exactly how much of this care was based on accumulated practical knowledge passed down through generations, and how much was closer to instinct, the same instinct that makes any parent in any era reach to comfort a hurt child. What the bones tell us again and again is that people tried. They tried with everything available to them, which was not very much, against threats they could feel but never truly see. And this is where her story, The Woman by the River with the Cut Across Her Palm, becomes not just one person's misfortune, but a doorway into an entire hidden layer of human history. Because what happened to her in the days that followed, that ordinary afternoon, happened in some form to countless people before her, and countless people after her. Across every continent, every era before medicine, as we understand it, existed. It happened to hunters who cut themselves preparing meat, to toolmakers whose hands slipped against flint, to children who scraped a knee running across rock, and to elders whose skin, thinning with age, no longer held closed the way it once had. Each of these moments was small, each of these moments was survivable in theory, and each of these moments, quietly without warning, could become the last ordinary day a person ever had. That is the world we are stepping into tonight. Not one shaped primarily by great battles or grand betrayals, but one shaped by something far closer to all of us. The fragile, constant negotiation between the human body and the world it was never fully protected from. We will follow that thread carefully from the smallest wound to the moment it could not be contained, from the bodies preserved in ice, to the bones that still after all this time remember exactly what happened to them. It begins, as so much of early human history does not, with a battle or a decision, but with something almost too small to notice. A single break in the skin, and everything that world did not yet know how to stop. The night that follows her injury by the river does not announce itself as anything unusual. She sleeps as she has slept most nights of her life, curled close to the warmth of others, the sound of breathing and settling fire filling the space around her. If her palm aches faintly beneath its makeshift binding of hide, it is the kind of ache that barely registers, the sort that fades beneath the deeper tiredness of a full day's work. She does not know, and has no way of knowing, that somewhere in the thin red line across her skin something has already begun. Not violence, not any single dramatic event, Just a quiet, patient process, the kind the body has been contending with for longer than anyone alive could remember. To understand what makes a moment like this so significant, it helps to step back from her for a while and look at the wider shape of the danger she has just stepped into, because what happened to her was not rare. It was, if anything, one of the most common threats a person could face across the enormous stretch of time before written history. Archaeologists working with skeletal remains from sites scattered across Europe and Asia have documented again and again a particular kind of scarring on bone, a roughened, inflamed texture called periostitis, that forms when infection reaches deep enough to provoke a reaction in the bone itself. It shows up disproportionately on forearms, on hands, on the small bones of the fingers, exactly the places most exposed during the daily work of shaping stone, scraping hides, and handling the sharp, unforgiving tools that made survival possible in the first place. In other words, the very act of staying alive, of making the tools and preparing the food that kept a person and their group fed, carried within it a quiet, recurring risk of the kind that could eventually end that same life. It's worth pausing here because there is something almost paradoxical in that fact, and paradox has a way of settling into the mind more deeply than simple tragedy does. The hands that shaped a blade sharp enough to butcher a carcass were the same hands most likely to be opened by that blade. The fingers that pressed flint against flint, striking off flake after flake with practiced patient control, were the fingers most exposed to the invisible world waiting in soil and hide and bone. There was no way around this. A group could not survive without tools, and tools could not be made without risk. Every single stone implement recovered from a prehistoric site, every scraper, every blade, every awl used to pierce leather carries within its history not just the story of what it made possible, but a quieter, harder to see story of what it occasionally cost. This is where a detail comes in that surprises even people who think they know this period of history reasonably well. In soil, particularly soil enriched by animal waste and decomposing organic matter, which describes nearly every campsite, riverbank and hunting ground, a prehistoric group would have used, there exists a bacterium that produces one of the most dangerous toxins found anywhere in nature. It does not require a large wound to take hold. It requires only a small break in the skin, a puncture, a scratch deep enough to create the low oxygen environment the bacterium needs to activate. Today we know this condition by its modern name, tetanus, and we understand it well enough to prevent it almost entirely. But for nearly the whole of human history it existed without a name at all, only as a terrifying and mysterious pattern. A person injured, seemingly healing, and then days or weeks later overtaken by stiffness, spasm, and a fever that would not break. No spear, no rival, no visible enemy. Just a wound that had already closed, betraying the person from beneath the surface of the skin. Scholars still debate how large a role tetanus specifically played in ancient mortality because, unlike a broken bone or a healed fracture, the disease itself leaves almost no mark on the skeleton. It moves quickly and it moves entirely within soft tissue that has long since returned to the earth. What we are left with in the vast majority of cases is not direct proof, but pattern gaps in the archaeological records, where a person's life simply ends without any visible skeletal cause, clustered in age ranges and seasons that align suspiciously well with periods of heavy tool use and field work. The evidence remains incomplete, and it likely always will, but the shape of what we can see is consistent enough that most researchers now regard minor puncture wounds, the kind barely worth mentioning at the time, as one of the more significant hidden causes of death across the deep prehistoric record. And this is not the only threat carried in that seemingly simple category of small injuries. Thorns the kind found on blackthorn and hawthorn bushes across much of ancient Europe were common enough hazards that some researchers believe certain early plant knowledge developed specifically around them, not just how to avoid them, but how to treat the punctures they left behind. There is fragmentary but genuinely fascinating evidence drawn from pollen analysis at several prehistoric sites, suggesting that some plants gathered by early humans were selected not for food but for properties we would now recognize as having mild antiseptic or anti-inflammatory qualities. Yarrow appears with notable frequency in this evidence. So does a particular type of moss, one that thousands of years later would be used by military field surgeons for its remarkable capacity to absorb fluid and inhibit bacterial growth long before anyone understood why it worked. What this suggests, cautiously and without overstating the case, is that some early human groups may have developed a working practical understanding of wound care that had nothing to do with formal knowledge and everything to do with generations of careful, repeated observation. Someone noticed at some point that a wound packed with a certain plant seemed to heal differently than one left alone. And that observation, however it was passed along, may have saved lives in ways we are only now beginning to piece together. It would be comforting to say that this kind of care was always enough. It was not. Even with the best available knowledge, even with careful attention and the instinctive practiced hands of people who had tended wounds many times before, the body does not always cooperate. Infection, once it establishes itself deeply enough, does not respond to intention or effort. It follows its own patient indifferent course, and in a world without any way to interrupt that course chemically, the outcome often came down to little more than the strength of the person's own immune response weighed against the aggressiveness of whatever had entered the wound. Some fought it off entirely, the injury fading into nothing more than a faint scar and a story told years later. Others were not so fortunate, and the difference between the two outcomes was frequently invisible in the earliest hours, which is in its own way one of the more unsettling truths at the centre of this history. There was no way to know in the moment which kind of wound you were dealing with. This uncertainty shaped more than individual survival. It shaped how early human groups understood danger itself. In a world where a visible threat, a predator, a storm, a fall from height could be reasoned with, prepared for, sometimes even avoided entirely through experience and caution, an infected wound offered no such logic. It could not be outrun or outsmarted. It simply arrived unannounced, weeks after the original injury had already been forgotten by everyone except the person carrying it. Some researchers who study the psychology embedded in prehistoric burial practices have suggested that this particular kind of unpredictability injury followed by delayed and seemingly unrelated illness may have contributed to some of the earliest recorded beliefs about unseen forces acting on the body. Beliefs that would eventually shape ritual medicine and religion for thousands of years afterward. It is a theory, not a certainty, and the evidence supporting it is interpretive rather than direct. But it offers a compelling suggestion of just how deeply this particular fear, the fear of the invisible, delayed consequence, may have shaped the earliest human understanding of illness itself. By the following morning, the woman by the river wakes to find her palm slightly warmer than it should be. Not alarmingly so, not yet. Just a faint heat beneath the binding, easy enough to dismiss, easy enough to attribute to the ordinary soreness of a healing cut. She flexes her fingers, notices the stiffness, and goes about the business of the morning, because there is food to gather, and work that does not pause for a minor discomfort. She has no reason yet to think of this as anything more than what it appears to be, but beneath the surface of her skin, in the quiet, unseen space where this story has been unfolding since the moment the stone slipped from her hand, something is beginning to shift into a different phase entirely, one that neither she nor anyone around her has any way of recognizing until it is already well underway. By midday, something has changed in a way she can no longer easily dismiss. The warmth beneath the binding has deepened into something closer to heat, a steady, insistent pulse of discomfort that rises and falls with her heartbeat. When she finally unwraps the hide covering her palm to check the wound, what she finds is no longer the thin, clean line from the day before. The edges have swollen, drawn tight and shining, and a faint reddish streak has begun creeping upward, tracing a path from her palm toward her wrist like something being drawn with deliberate intent. She does not know what this means, not in any language she has words for, but something older than language, something closer to instinct tells her this is different from ordinary healing. This is the body sending a signal, and the signal is not good. What is happening beneath her skin at this stage is, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable processes the human body is capable of, even as it becomes dangerous. And the reddish line she notices is not the infection spreading randomly through her flesh. It follows a specific structure, a network of thin vessels that exist throughout the body for exactly this purpose, carrying immune cells toward the site of an intrusion and when necessary, sweeping infected material towards small filtering stations positioned at key points along the arm, the underarm, the neck. This is the lymphatic system, and though no prehistoric person could have named it or understood its architecture, its consequences would have been entirely familiar to them. A swollen, tender lump beneath the arm appearing days after a hand injury was common enough that some anthropologists studying burial patterns believe certain groups developed practical, if unspoken, associations between hand wounds and this particular kind of swelling, treating its appearance as a serious escalation requiring more direct intervention, even without any biological explanation. Why the two were connected. It is worth sitting with this for a moment because there is something quietly moving in it. These were people without microscopes, without any concept of bacteria or blood cells, and yet the pattern of cause and consequence was clear enough, repeated often enough across enough lives that they built a kind of working knowledge around it anyway. They could not see what was happening, but they could see what it led to, and that was often enough to act on. The path this infection takes from here follows one of two broad directions, and which direction it follows says a great deal about the particular danger the body is facing. In many cases, the immune system succeeds in containing the intrusion close to its source, walling it off, fighting it back, allowing the swelling to peak and then slowly recede over the following days as the body wins its quiet, invisible battle. This is, in fact, the more common outcome, and it is worth remembering, especially at this point in the story, that most wounds like hers did heal, most cuts closed, most people survived the small mistakes their daily lives required of them. If this were not true, if every scratch and every splinter carried a serious risk of death, human beings could never have endured long enough to become the species that eventually filled every continent on Earth. The danger in this story is real, but it lived inside a larger truth of resilience of bodies that, more often than not, did exactly what they had evolved over enormous stretches of time to do. But sometimes the infection does not stay contained. Sometimes for reasons that depended on the specific organism involved. The depth of the original wound, the person's overall health, and a certain amount of pure and uncontrollable chance, the infection breaks past the body's early defenses and enters the bloodstream directly. This is the condition modern medicine recognizes as sepsis, and it represents an entirely different order of danger than a localized wound infection. Once bacteria and the toxins they release begin circulating freely through the blood, the threat is no longer confined to one hand, one arm, one part of the body. It becomes systemic, provoking a body-wide response that in its most severe form can begin attacking the very organs it was meant to protect. Fever climbs rapidly. The heart races to compensate for dropping blood pressure. Breathing quickens. In its final stages, before medicine understood any of this, sepsis often produced a strange and eerie calm in the person affected, a period where the surrounding group might have believed the worst had passed, even as the body's internal systems were beginning one by one to fail. There is a particular kind of quiet tragedy embedded in that detail, the false calm that sometimes precedes the end. It means that the people caring for someone in this condition People who loved them, who had likely tended wounds like this many times before and watched them heal, may have felt a genuine and understandable relief in those final hours, only to watch that relief prove tragically premature. We cannot know, of course, exactly how any individual prehistoric death unfolded in this kind of intimate detail. The evidence remains incomplete by its very nature, built from bone and inference rather than testimony. But the biological process itself has not changed across tens of thousands of years, and understanding how it unfolds today gives us a careful, respectful window into what many of these ancient deaths likely looked like from the inside. Even if we will never know the names of the people who experienced them, there is another detail worth including here, one that surprises even people who have spent time with this period of history, because it did not require any wound at all in the way we typically imagine one. Dental abscesses, infections originating deep within the root of a tooth, were remarkably common across the ancient world, and they followed a strikingly similar and equally dangerous path. Skeletal remains from numerous prehistoric sites show clear evidence of these infections, small, telltale holes in the jawbone where an abscess drained repeatedly over months or even years before either healing, or in a significant number of cases ultimately proving fatal. Unlike a cut on the hand, a dental abscess offered no visible warning sign to anyone else in the group, no swelling easily noticed, no obvious injury to explain the growing pain. It simply worsened quietly. Inside the one place infection had the shortest possible distance to travel before reaching the bloodstream directly. Scholars still debate how frequently dental infection alone served as the final decisive cause of death in prehistoric populations, since the skeletal evidence shows the abscess itself, but rarely proves conclusively that it rather than some other complication delivered the fatal blow. But the pattern across enough remains, across enough sites and enough centuries, suggests strongly that a source of pain many of us today would treat with a single visit to a dentist was, for most of human history, a condition capable of ending a life entirely on its own. What both of these threats share, the infected wound and the infected tooth, is something that runs quietly beneath this entire story. And it is worth naming directly because it says something true, not just about the deep past, but about the peculiar vulnerability of being human at all. We are in a very real sense built with an internal contradiction. The same immune response that protects us, that fights off invaders and heals our wounds, is also capable, under the wrong circumstances, of turning that same defensive intensity against the body it was meant to protect. There was no cruelty in this. No malice, no failure of character, nothing a person could have done differently through greater caution or greater strength. It was simply the terms of being alive in a body built by evolution to fight hard against threats. It could not always distinguish cleanly between minor and catastrophic. For nearly the entire span of human history before antibiotics existed in any form, that contradiction sat quietly inside every person, waiting most of the time for nothing at all to happen, and occasionally without warning deciding everything. Back beside the river, in the particular life we've been following, the fever has not yet fully taken hold. It arrives gradually, the way most serious things in this story do, not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a slow accumulation of small, individually forgettable signs. A slight chill despite the day's warmth. A reluctance to eat that no one around her thinks twice about. A tiredness that settles into her shoulders and does not lift even after resting. If you'd been standing beside her that afternoon watching her move a little more slowly than usual through the camp, you likely would not have known anything was seriously wrong. That is in many ways the quiet horror sitting at the center of this entire chapter of human history. The body does not always announce its crises loudly. Sometimes it simply gradually begins to lose in ways too subtle for anyone standing nearby to recognize, until there is very little time left to change the outcome. And this is precisely the point where the people around her, the ones who share her fire, her food, and her nights, begin to matter in ways that go far beyond simple companionship. Because what happens next in this story does not depend only on what her body is capable of doing on its own. It depends in ways we are only beginning to fully appreciate through the archaeological record on whether anyone around her notices and whether anyone around her knows, in whatever fragile and imperfect way early humans could know anything about the invisible processes unfolding beneath someone's skin, what to do next. The fire beside her burns lower as the night deepens, and it is her sister, or perhaps a woman close enough in the group's structure to be called one, who first notices that something in her breathing has changed. Shallow, quick, catching slightly at the top of each breath in a way that has nothing to do with cold. She kneels close, presses the back of her hand against her sister's forehead, and feels the heat there, unmistakable now, no longer something to be talked around or waited out until morning. What follows is not panic. There is no scene of shouting or scrambling in the dark. Instead, quietly, deliberately, the woman begins to do the only things available to her, things passed down through hands rather than words, through watching rather than teaching in any formal sense we would recognize. She loosens the binding on the wounded palm first, because pressure against swollen, heated flesh only worsens the ache beneath it. She soaks a strip of soft hide in cool water, carried up from the river earlier that evening, and lays it gently across her sister's forehead, replacing it again and again as it warms in a rhythm that would be instantly familiar to any parent in any century who has ever sat beside a feverish child through the night. Somewhere nearby, someone crushes a handful of dried yarrow between two stones and presses the resulting paste directly against the wound itself. We cannot know, watching this scene reconstruct itself from what the archaeological record allows us to infer, whether she understood precisely why this particular plant seemed to matter, or whether it was simply something her own mother had done for her, once passed forward the way so much survival knowledge was, without explanation, simply because it had worked before and there was no reason to abandon what had worked. What is worth pausing on here is something that easily gets lost in stories about ancient danger, which is how much deliberate, patient effort went into fighting back against it. This was not a passive world where illness simply happened to people while everyone else waited to see the outcome. Wound care during this period of prehistory, though, undocumented in any written form left behind, a surprisingly rich trail of physical evidence, and one particular discovery reframes almost everything we thought we understood about how early these medical instincts actually developed. In a cave system on the island of Borneo, archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of a young person who had at some point in early adolescence undergone the deliberate amputation of a lower leg. The bone had healed cleanly, the remaining limb showing clear evidence of new growth and remodeling consistent with survival for years afterward into full adulthood. What makes this discovery so remarkable is its age. The remains date back roughly 31,000 years, making this the earliest confirmed evidence of successful surgical amputation anywhere in the world, far earlier than most researchers believed such complex medical intervention was possible. Consider what that actually required. Whoever performed this procedure understood on some practical level how to control catastrophic bleeding from a major limb. They understood, whether through instinct or accumulated observation, the importance of keeping the wound clean enough afterward to prevent the kind of overwhelming infection that could easily have killed a person far more quickly than the original injury ever would have. And perhaps most strikingly, this was a community capable of caring for a young person through a lengthy recovery, carrying them, feeding them, protecting them during a period when they could contribute little to the group's daily survival. This single skeleton complicates a story that for a long time framed prehistoric life almost entirely around scarcity and self-interest. Every person expected to pull their own weight or be left behind. The evidence increasingly points towards something more complicated, and in many ways more moving. Groups that made room deliberately and at real cost to themselves for members who could not immediately repay that investment. Is it strange then to imagine that same instinct, that same willingness to sit through a long night, tending a wound that might not heal, extending backward across tens of thousands of years, to a woman beside a river whose name we will never know, perhaps not? The impulse to care for the injured and the sick appears to run remarkably deep in our shared history, deeper in fact than many other traits we tend to think of as uniquely recognizably human. Scholars still debate how widespread this kind of intentional medical care actually was across different prehistoric populations, and how much of it reflects genuine accumulated knowledge as opposed to instinctive comfort offered simply because watching someone suffer without acting is for most people unbearable. The Borneo amputation remains so far an exceptional find rather than proof of universal practice, and it would be a mistake to assume every group facing a serious wound possess the same level of skill or the same resources to act on it. Evidence like this tends to arrive in isolated, extraordinary fragments, a single skeleton here, a cluster of unusual grave goods there, and piecing together the full picture of how common or rare this kind of care truly was remains one of the more genuinely open questions in the field. What we can say with more confidence is what tends to happen physiologically once a fever like the one gripping her that night reaches its peak. The heat itself, uncomfortable and frightening as it appears, is not simply a symptom to be endured. It is in a very real sense a weapon the body deploys, deliberately raising its internal temperature specifically to create conditions less favorable for the bacteria, multiplying within her bloodstream, while simultaneously accelerating the immune response working to identify and destroy them. This is why so many prehistoric wound care practices cooling the skin with damp cloth while allowing the internal fever to continue its work show a surprisingly sophisticated, intuitive understanding of a process no one at the time could have explained in biological terms. They were not simply trying to make her comfortable. On some level, whether consciously understood or not, they were trying to help her body do the very thing it needed to do without letting the fever climb high enough to become dangerous on its own. There is a narrow and genuinely perilous window in a crisis like this one that separates recovery from catastrophe, and it has nothing to do with willpower or strength of character. It has to do almost entirely with a kind of biological negotiation happening far beneath conscious awareness, a contest between how quickly the infection multiplies and how effectively the immune system responds, weighed against how much physical reserve the person has left to draw upon after days of reduced eating and disrupted rest. Some bodies win this contest with room to spare. Others lose it by the smallest of margins in ways that even with everything we understand today remain difficult to predict with certainty in any individual case. For her, as the night wears on and the fire beside her burns down to embers, the fever begins very gradually to loosen its grip. It does not break all at once the way illness sometimes resolves in stories told for dramatic effect. It recedes the way most real recoveries do in small uneven steps, a slightly cooler forehead here, a slightly steadier breath there, until sometime near dawn her sister notices that the damp cloth she replaces no longer warms quite as quickly as it did only hours before. By the time full light returns to the camp, the immediate danger has passed, though the healing ahead of her will still take considerable time, and the scar left behind, both on her palm and in some quieter way on the memory of everyone who sat beside her through the night, will remain long after the wound itself has closed. She is in this particular telling one of the fortunate ones. It is worth being honest about that, because for every skeleton recovered with clear evidence of healed injury, evidence that speaks to survival against genuine odds, there are others recovered with the opposite story written into their bones, injuries that show no sign of healing at all, infections that clearly won the contest they were engaged in. Both outcomes existed side by side throughout this period of human history, inseparable from one another, each one equally true, and it is precisely that uncertainty, the fact that no one, not the injured person and not the people caring for them, could ever know in advance which outcome awaited them, that made even the smallest wound carry the particular weight it did. And her hand was in the end only ever half of the danger this world contained. A cut like hers threatened quietly from within over the slow course of days, but there was another kind of injury altogether, one that struck all at once, that could not be bandaged shut or waited out beside a fire, and that carried consequences reaching far beyond a single person's survival, extending outward to threaten the movement and safety of an entire group travelling together across land that offered no permission to stay still for long. Somewhere else, in a different season and likely a different corner of the ancient world entirely, a very different kind of accident is unfolding, one with none of the quiet, invisible progression of an infected wound. A man moving quickly across uneven ground, perhaps chasing wounded game or simply hurrying to close distance with his group before nightfall, plants his foot wrong on a loose stone hidden beneath fallen leaves. The sound that follows a sharp, distinct crack is unmistakable even to those some distance away. He goes down hard, and when he tries to rise again, his leg will not hold his weight. There is no ambiguity in this injury, no days of uncertain waiting to see which direction it turns. Everyone nearby understands immediately exactly what has happened and exactly how serious it is. A broken bone announces itself in a way an infection never does, and in some sense that immediacy makes it feel like the more straightforward danger of the two. There is no invisible battle being waged beneath the skin, no need to wait and wonder. And yet a fracture like this one carried a different kind of threat, entirely one that had less to do with the injury itself and everything to do with the world surrounding the person who carried it. Because for a group that survived by following migrating herds, by moving toward water sources as the season shifted, by staying only as long as a given stretch of land could reasonably feed everyone gathered, there a person who could no longer walk was not simply injured. They had become, through no fault of their own, a question the entire group would eventually be forced to answer. It helps to understand before going further just how physically demanding mobility actually was for most prehistoric populations. Estimates drawn from skeletal wear patterns and comparative studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest that many groups covered considerable distances on a regular basis, sometimes shifting camp every few weeks, occasionally more often depending on local resources and the season. This was not the movement for its own sake. It was survival calibrated with precision to the rhythms of the land itself, following game, following ripening plants, following water as it appeared and disappeared across the year. A group that stayed too long in one place risked exhausting what that place had to offer. A group that moved too slowly risked missing the narrow window when a particular resource was actually available. Into this finely balanced system, a broken leg introduced an entirely new and difficult variable, one that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the immediate physical reality of a person who simply could not keep pace. What did groups actually do faced with this situation? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, and this remains one of the more genuinely debated areas within the broader study of prehistoric social behavior. The evidence that does exist, however, tends to complicate the assumption many people carry instinctively, the assumption that early human groups operating under such precarious conditions would have had little choice but to leave behind anyone who could not keep up. Numerous skeletal remains recovered from sites across multiple continents show fractures that healed, sometimes healed imperfectly with visible misalignment or shortening of the limb, but healed nonetheless, meaning the person survived for a significant period afterwards, sometimes for years. A healed fracture is not simply evidence of injury, It is evidence of time of a body given the chance to knit itself back together, which almost certainly required the group around that person to slow down or wait, or in some documented cases appears to have required a portion of the group to remain behind temporarily while the rest continued on splitting resources and responsibility in ways that would have carried real cost to everyone involved. There is a particular skeleton recovered decades ago in a river valley in what is now Illinois, belonging to a man who lived roughly 6,000 years before the present, that illustrates this tension especially clearly. His remains show a severely fractured femur, the largest bone in the human leg, broken badly enough that under normal circumstances it would have made walking, let alone hunting or gathering, essentially impossible for an extended period. And yet the bone shows clear, extensive healing remodeled over what researchers estimate to be a period of many months, quite possibly longer. He did not die from this injury. He lived with it likely for years afterward, the bone eventually setting into a permanently shortened and slightly rotated position that would have left him with a pronounced limp for the remainder of his life. Someone, or more likely several people, made the deliberate choice to support him through a recovery period that offered no guarantee of success and no immediate benefit to the group's ongoing survival. What does it say about a community that they were willing to absorb that kind of cost for one of their own? This is not to suggest that every group in every circumstance responded the same way. The evidence remains genuinely mixed on this point, and it would be dishonest to present a single unified picture of universal unconditional care. Environmental pressure almost certainly played a significant role in shaping these decisions. A group living somewhere resource-rich and relatively stable likely had far more flexibility to slow down and wait than a group moving through marginal, difficult terrain where delay itself carried serious risk for everyone injured or not. Some researchers argue that decisions around care for the injured were far more situational and pragmatic than romantic narratives sometimes suggest, weighed carefully against the immediate survival needs of the larger group rather than governed purely by sentiment. Others point to the sheer frequency of healed fractures across the archaeological record as evidence that support for the injured was in fact closer to a norm than an exception, deeply embedded in how these societies understood their obligations to one another. The truth very likely sits somewhere between these positions, shifting from group to group, season to season, shaped by circumstances we can only partially reconstruct from what bone alone is able to tell us. What complicates this picture further and adds a layer rarely discussed even among people reasonably familiar with this period is the question of how these fractures were actually treated in the moment, because the archaeological record offers hints here that are genuinely remarkable. Evidence recovered from several sites suggests some use of rudimentary splinting bindings crafted from bark hide, and in certain cases what appears to be deliberately shaped wood positioned to hold an injured limb still during the earliest and most critical phase of healing. This is not something every prehistoric group necessarily possessed the knowledge to do, and the evidence for it remains sparse and scattered rather than consistent across regions and time periods. But where it does appear, it suggests a level of practical accumulated medical understanding considerably more sophisticated than the image many people carry of prehistoric life as purely reactive, purely instinctive without any deliberate strategy behind it. Consider too what recovery actually demanded beyond the initial setting of the bone. Someone needed to bring this person food likely for weeks, possibly for months, while they were unable to gather or hunt for themselves. Someone needed to help them relieve themselves, clean any secondary wounds that might develop from prolonged immobility, and manage the very real risk of the injury reopening if movement resumed too early. This kind of sustained, unglamorous, physically demanding care rarely survives in the archaeological record with the clarity a healed bone provides, and yet it must have happened consistently for these healed fractures to exist at all. It is in its own quiet way one of the more moving forms of evidence. This period of history leaves behind not the bone itself, but everything the healed bone silently implies about the people surrounding the person who carried it. And here the evidence remains genuinely incomplete in ways worth stating honestly. We cannot know from a skeleton alone whether the care that produced a particular healed fracture came from deep affection, from a sense of obligation tied to kinship, from practical calculation about the person's future usefulness to the group, or from some combination of all three that shifted day by day as the recovery dragged on longer than anyone initially expected. What we can say is that the outcome, in enough cases to be statistically significant across the archaeological record, was survival rather than abandonment. And that alone tells us something meaningful about how these societies actually functioned, regardless of the precise emotional texture behind any single decision. Not every broken bone ended this way, of course. For every healed fracture recovered from an ancient burial site, there exist others that show no evidence of healing at all. Injuries that likely proved fatal either directly through complications like the infections we have already followed closely in this story, or indirectly through the simple, unforgiving mathematics of a group that could not afford to slow its pace during a season when survival depended entirely on reaching the next resource in time. Some individuals, the evidence suggests, were left behind, whether through deliberate necessity or circumstances beyond anyone's control, and their remains, when found at all, tell a far quieter and more difficult story than the ones who recovered and lived to carry their healed bones into old age. It is a difficult truth. Sitting at the center of this particular danger one, this history does not need to soften to remain honest. A broken leg was never simply a medical event. It was in a very real sense a test of the entire social fabric surrounding the injured person, revealing exactly how far a group was willing to bend its own survival strategy to protect one member who could no longer contribute to it in the immediate term. Some groups bent considerably, others, under different pressures, could not. And somewhere in that uncomfortable, honest space between those two possibilities lies a version of human nature that feels, even across this enormous distance of time, entirely and unmistakably recognizable. There was, however, one particular kind of injury that tested this same fragile balance in an even more immediate and intimate way, one that arrived without warning on a day that otherwise looked exactly like any other. And that placed the greatest possible weight not on a hunter moving across open ground, but on a mother in the quietest and most private moment her world was capable of offering her. The particular vulnerability at the center of childbirth begins, in a sense, long before any individual woman ever goes into labor. It begins in the shape of the human body itself, in a compromise struck deep in our evolutionary past between two competing pressures that never fully resolve themselves. Walking upright on two legs, the trait that defines us as a species more than almost any other, required a narrower pelvis than our tree-dwelling ancestors carried. At roughly the same time, across an enormous span of evolutionary history, the human brain was growing larger, and larger brains meant larger skulls passing through that same narrowed passage. Researchers refer to this tension as the obstetric dilemma, though scholars still debate how much of childbirth's inherent difficulty can be traced to this specific evolutionary trade-off versus other contributing factors that likely played a role alongside it. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Human birth, compared with almost every other species on Earth, is unusually difficult, unusually painful, and unusually dangerous, not as some cruel exception to nature's design, but as the direct physical consequence of the very traits that made us who we are. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it reframes something people sometimes misunderstand about this period of history. The dangers surrounding childbirth in the ancient world were not simply the result of primitive conditions or a lack of knowledge, though both certainly played a role. They were built in part into the fundamental architecture of the human body itself, a risk carried by every woman who has ever given birth, in every era, including our own. What changed over time was not the underlying biology. What changed was everything surrounding it, the tools, the knowledge, the intervention available in the moments when biology alone was not enough. Picture for a moment a woman in a settlement near the edge of a river valley, sometime during the early agricultural period, roughly 7 or 8,000 years ago. Her day begins in a manner entirely unremarkable. There is grain to grind, water to carry a fire that needs tending before the others wake. She is close to her time, though not so close that anyone around her expects anything unusual before the week is out. And then sometime in the early afternoon, the first deep, low pull of labour announces itself, and the ordinary rhythm of her day quietly gives way to something else entirely. Childbirth in this period was rarely a solitary event, and this detail alone surprises many people who imagine ancient life as isolated and sparse. Archaeological and anthropological evidence drawn both from burial patterns and from careful study of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies whose practices offer a cautious window into deeper history suggests that women almost universally gave birth surrounded by other women, often specifically older women who had been through labour themselves and had over years accumulated a working knowledge of what to expect and what to do when something began going wrong. In many respects, this arrangement represents one of the earliest identifiable forms of specialized medical care in human history, a role filled not by formal training in the way we understand it today, but by direct, repeated, hard-won experience passed from one generation of women to the next. This support mattered enormously because childbirth carried several distinct dangers, each one capable of ending in tragedy, through an entirely different mechanism. Obstructed labour, where the position of the child made a natural delivery difficult or impossible, could stretch on for a day or more, exhausting the mother and placing both her and the child at severe risk. Skeletal evidence from numerous sites shows what researchers interpret as maternal remains alongside infant remains in the same burial, close enough in position and context to suggest death occurred during or shortly after labour, a pattern repeated with striking consistency across cultures and centuries far too distant from one another to have influenced each other directly. It is one of the more quietly devastating categories of evidence in the entire archaeological record, a mother and child braid together, their story ending at the very moment it should have begun. Even when labour itself proceeded without this kind of obstruction, danger did not end with the child's birth. Postpartum hemorrhage, uncontrolled bleeding following delivery, represents one of the leading causes of maternal death, not only throughout ancient history but remarkably well into the modern era, and in parts of the world with limited access to emergency medical care it remains a serious risk even today. Without any understanding of what specifically caused this bleeding, or any medical tool capable of reliably stopping it, ancient birth attendants were left with remarkably limited options: direct pressure, certain plants believed to encourage the uterus to contract more forcefully, and when these measures failed, very little else beyond simply staying present, offering whatever comfort remained possible as the situation moved beyond anyone's ability to change its outcome. There is a further danger here worth naming carefully because it connects directly back to something already explored earlier in this story, and its presence in the context of childbirth adds a genuinely surprising layer to the picture. Infection following delivery, what would later become known in clinical terms as puerperal fever, represented one of the most significant threats a new mother faced, often striking days after what had appeared to be a successful and uncomplicated birth. The wound left behind by childbirth, largely internal and entirely invisible to anyone observing from outside, created exactly the kind of vulnerable opening that infection required, and without any concept of what we would now call basic hygiene in the modern clinical sense, this risk was constant across essentially every ancient birth. What makes this detail particularly striking is how long this specific danger persisted essentially unchanged, into eras we think of as far more medically advanced. As recently as the middle of the 19th century, a physician working in Vienna named Ignaz Semmelweis identified that maternal deaths from this exact kind of infection dropped dramatically once doctors began washing their hands between examining patients, a discovery that astonishingly was widely ridiculed and rejected by much of the medical establishment of his time. The danger a woman faced giving birth beside a river 10,000 years ago, and the danger a woman faced giving birth in a European hospital less than 2 centuries ago were in this particular respect disturbingly similar, separated by an almost unbroken thread of vulnerability that modern medicine only recently and with considerable resistance learned to interrupt. Does it feel strange to realize how recently this particular danger was finally understood and addressed after having threatened mothers for the entire span of human history before that point? It is one of the more sobering realities embedded in this story, a reminder that the line separating ancient danger from modern safety is in places far thinner and far more recent than we tend to assume. Back beside the river valley, the labour continues into the evening, difficult but not as far as the women attending her can tell, dangerously obstructed. The child arrives as the light outside begins to fade, small, healthy, immediately drawing breath in the particular way that brings visible relief to everyone gathered close. For a brief window, everything appears to have gone as well as anyone could reasonably hope. And then, in the way this story has already shown itself capable of turning, the bleeding that should slow within a reasonable stretch of time does not slow. It continues steady and then insistent, soaking through layer after layer of the soft hide pressed against her by the women working urgently now beside her, their earlier calm giving way to a focused, practiced kind of intensity that suggests this is not the first time they have faced a moment exactly like this one. We cannot know from the physical evidence alone how any single birth like this one actually concluded, whether the bleeding slowed on its own, whether whatever herbal preparation was pressed to use in that moment proved effective, or whether, despite every effort made by the women surrounding her, nature simply followed its own indifferent course. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete here in a way that feels especially difficult to sit with, because unlike a healed fracture or a scarred bone that tells its story plainly, decades later the outcome of any individual birth like this one is almost entirely lost to us, preserved only in the aggregate patterns visible across thousands of burials rather than in the specific human details of any single night beside any single fire. What those aggregate patterns do tell us with reasonable confidence is shearing in its scale. Estimates drawn from skeletal populations across multiple ancient societies suggest that maternal mortality during this period likely ranged somewhere between 1 and 2% of all births, and when multiplied across a woman's entire reproductive life, often spanning 8, 10, sometimes more pregnancies across her lifetime, the cumulative risk facing any individual woman was considerably higher than that single number might initially suggest. Childbirth, in other words, was not simply one dangerous event among many that a woman might statistically encounter once. For most women in the ancient world, it was a danger revisited again and again across the course of an entire adult life, each pregnancy carrying its own independent chance of becoming the one that did not end safely. And yet it is important to hold this alongside another truth, one that balances the weight of this particular danger without diminishing it. The overwhelming majority of births, even under these difficult and unprotected conditions, did end safely. Children were born, mothers survived, families grew generation folding into generation across the enormous unbroken chain of human continuity that eventually leads all the way to every person listening to this story tonight. Danger and survival existed side by side in this world, inseparable from one another, and the presence of one does not erase the frequency of the other. Most women who went into labour beside a fire surrounded by other women who had done this many times before walked away from that night changed but alive, carrying a child who would grow in time to tell their own children stories about a world that could be gentler than it sometimes seemed. For the woman in this particular telling, the bleeding does eventually begin to slow easing gradually as the night wears on the women around her, finally allowing themselves to exhale sometime near dawn when it becomes clear that whatever crisis had gripped the hours before has for now passed. She will carry a particular kind of exhaustion for weeks afterward, and a story she will likely tell for years to come about the night her child was born beneath the sky. She remembers with unusual clarity precisely because of how close that night came to ending differently than it did. It would be easy at this point in the story to assume that danger of this kind belonged only to the body, to wounds and fevers, and the difficult physical business of bringing new life into an unforgiving world. But there was another category of evidence, entirely one that required no injury, no illness, and no single dramatic moment of crisis at all. Evidence that had been quietly accumulating for tens of thousands of years in the one place capable of holding it patiently enough for us to finally learn how to read it. That place is bone itself, and it is worth understanding before going any further into what it reveals just how remarkable a material bone actually is as a keeper of memory. Living bone is not the static inert structure it appears to be. It is constantly rebuilding itself throughout a person's life, laying down new material and breaking down old material in a continuous quiet process that responds directly to the stresses placed upon it, the injuries it sustains, and the diseases that pass through it. This means that bone does not simply break and heal in a way that erases what happened. It records it. Every infection serious enough to reach bone tissue, every fracture, every period of malnutrition severe enough to interrupt normal growth leaves behind a signature subtle but legible if you know how to read it and are willing to spend the time required to learn its particular language. The scientists who have learned this language call themselves paleopathologists, and their work sits at an unusual and genuinely fascinating intersection of archaeology, medicine, and something closer to detective work than either of those fields typically involves on their own. Their task is to take a skeleton sometimes remarkably complete, sometimes reduced to only a handful of surviving bones, and reconstruct from it not just how a person died, but how they lived, what illnesses moved through their body, what injuries they endured and recovered from, and in the most fortunate cases, even a rough sense of what their final days might have looked like. The methods involved here have grown considerably more sophisticated over the past several decades, and this itself represents a detail worth pausing on because it means our understanding of ancient death is not fixed. It continues changing, sometimes dramatically, as technology advances. Where earlier generations of researchers relied almost entirely on visual examination of bone-measuring lesions, noting unusual growths, comparing patterns of wear against known modern conditions, contemporary paleopathology draws on tools that would have seemed like something closer to science fiction only a few decades ago. Isotope analysis, examining the specific chemical signatures locked within bone and tooth enamel, can now reveal startlingly precise details about a person's diet, and in some cases where they spent their childhood versus where they died, since certain isotopes absorbed from local water and food sources shift meaningfully from region to region. Ancient deoxyribonucleic acid extracted with increasing success even from remains tens of thousands of years old can now identify specific pathogens, directly moving the field beyond inference and educated guesswork towards something closer to genuine diagnosis, performed on patients who have been dead for an almost unimaginable length of time. This precision has occasionally overturned assumptions that stood essentially unquestioned for generations. For a long stretch of the 20th century, many researchers believed certain infectious diseases, tuberculosis prominent among them, arrived relatively late in human history, spreading primarily alongside the growth of dense agricultural settlements where crowded populations and close contact with domesticated animals created ideal conditions for disease transmission. Genetic evidence recovered more recently from far older remains has complicated this picture considerably, pushing the presence of tuberculosis in human populations back much further than previously assumed, and reopening genuine scientific debate about exactly how and when this particular disease first established itself within our species. Scholars still debate the precise timeline, and the evidence continues shifting as more remains are analysed using increasingly refined techniques. But the larger lesson embedded in this ongoing debate matters just as much as any specific date. What we believe about ancient disease is not a fixed, settled body of knowledge. It is an active, evolving field capable of genuine revision as new evidence and new method become available. There is something almost moving in this if you sit with it long enough. Consider what it actually means that a person who died tens of thousands of years ago, entirely unknown to history, without a name that survived, without a single written record marking their existence, can still, through nothing more than the careful, patient study of their remains, tell us something true and specific about their life. In a very real sense, paleopathology allows the dead to speak, not through any voice or language, but through the physical, undeniable testimony written into their own skeleton evidence that requires no interpretation through myth or legend, only careful, rigorous attention from someone willing to listen closely enough. This process is rarely simple, and it is worth being honest about its genuine limitations, because acknowledging them only strengthens the credibility of what the field has managed to establish. Bone can only record certain kinds of information. A soft tissue infection that killed someone quickly before it had time to leave any lasting mark on the skeleton itself vanishes from the archaeological record almost entirely, leaving researchers to infer its presence indirectly, through demographic patterns and circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. Similarly, distinguishing between different diseases capable of producing broadly similar changes in bone tissue remains genuinely difficult in many cases, requiring researchers to weigh probability rather than certainty and to hold their conclusions with appropriate humility even after considerable analysis. And yet, despite these real limitations, the accumulated picture built from thousands of individually studied skeletons across the world has proven remarkably consistent in certain key respects, reinforcing many of the patterns already explored throughout this story. Evidence of healed fractures appears with notable frequency across nearly every prehistoric population studied in meaningful depth, confirming that injury and recovery were common, ordinary features of ancient life rather than rare exceptions. Evidence of infection visible in bone as small pitted lesions or areas of unusual roughness and thickening appears consistently as well distributed in patterns that align closely with the specific dangers already described. Hands, forearms, the jaw itself in cases involving dental infection, and evidence surrounding childbirth, though considerably harder to interpret directly from skeletal remains alone, emerges clearly enough in demographic patterns in the age distribution of female remains across large burial populations to confirm what those aggregate mortality estimates already suggested about the particular risk women faced repeatedly across their reproductive lives. What makes this evidence so quietly powerful rather than simply clinical or academic is what it ultimately restores to people who would otherwise have vanished from history entirely without trace, without acknowledgement, without anyone in the present ever knowing they had lived at all. A skeleton recovered from beneath layers of accumulated soil, examined carefully by researchers working with genuine patience and respect for what they are handling, becomes something closer to a testimony than a specimen. It says in the only language available to it, after all this time this person existed. They were injured, and in some cases they recovered. They fought illness, and sometimes they survived it. They lived a full human life with all the fragility and resilience that implies long before anyone thought to write any of it down. Among the many thousands of individual remains examined by researchers working in this field over the past century, A small handful stand out with particular clarity cases where the preservation was so exceptional, the surrounding context so rich that researchers have been able to reconstruct not just a general pattern of ancient danger, but something approaching the specific individual story of one person's final days. Two of these cases in particular offer an unusually intimate window into everything this story has been building toward, one preserved not in soil at all but in ice that held its secret for over 5,000 years before revealing it to two hikers who had no idea on an otherwise ordinary afternoon in the mountains what they were about to find. The 19th of September, 1991, begins as an unremarkable day for two hikers making their way through the Ötztal Alps along the border between Austria and Italy at an altitude high enough that summer snow rarely fully clears even in the warmest months. What they notice first is strange, precisely because of how ordinary it initially seems, a shape protruding from melting ice, brownish and weathered that they assume reasonably enough to be the remains of a modern mountaineer, someone lost in a storm decades earlier, finally surfacing as the glacier around him continued its slow retreat. It takes several days and the involvement of actual archaeologists rather than mountain rescue teams before anyone realizes the truth. The man they have found did not die decades ago. He died over 5,000 years ago, and the ice that killed him is the very thing that preserved him well enough for us to eventually know almost everything about how his final days unfolded. He has come to be known in the years since his discovery as the Iceman, or sometimes by the name of the region where he was found, Ötzi, and very few individual human beings from the deep past have ever been studied with the sheer depth and precision that his remains have allowed. This is due almost entirely to an accident of preservation so rare that researchers still consider it extraordinary even now, decades into ongoing study. The specific combination of rapid freezing shortly after death followed by burial beneath ice that remained largely undisturbed for 5,000 years prevented the normal processes of decay that destroy soft tissue in almost every other archaeological context. What researchers were left with was not simply a skeleton, the kind of evidence this story has relied on throughout, but something dramatically more complete: skin, muscle, organs, even the specific contents of his final meals, all preserved well enough for direct examination using tools no one could have imagined when his body was first discovered. What that examination eventually revealed complicates in a genuinely fascinating way everything this story has explored so far about the nature of ancient danger, because Ötzi's death was not simple and it was not the result of any single isolated cause. It was instead a convergence, several separate and serious threats intersecting within the same failing body during what were very likely the final hours of his life. The most immediate and dramatic finding, discovered years after his initial recovery, when researchers finally performed a more thorough scan of his remains, was an arrowhead lodged deep within his left shoulder, having torn through a major blood vessel on its way in. This single detail transformed how researchers understood his death entirely. For years following his discovery, many assumed Ötzi had simply succumbed to exposure, a traveller caught by an early storm high in the mountains, freezing to death alone. The arrowhead revealed something considerably more violent, evidence suggesting he was shot from behind, likely by someone pursuing him, and that he bled internally from this wound in the final stretch of time before his death. Traces of another person's blood found on his knife and on one of his arrows suggest he may have been engaged in some kind of physical struggle in the period immediately preceding his death. Though scholars still debate the exact sequence of events, since the physical evidence, while remarkably rich, cannot fully reconstruct motive relationship or the precise unfolding of whatever conflict led to that final fatal shot. What makes Ötzi's story relevant to everything this particular narrative has been building toward, however, is not primarily the arrow itself, dramatic as that discovery was. It is what researchers found when they examined the rest of his body beyond the immediate and obvious violence of his final hours. Genetic analysis of tissue samples revealed that Ötzi was at the time of his death suffering from an active infection of Borrelia bacteria, the same pathogen responsible for what we now know as Lyme disease, most likely contracted from a tick bite at some point in the weeks or months before he died. He also showed clear evidence of whipworm infestation in his intestines, a parasitic infection that, while not immediately fatal on its own, would have contributed to ongoing physical stress and reduced overall resilience. His arteries showed signs of what researchers describe as significant hardening, a condition many people assume belongs exclusively to modern diets and modern sedentary living present in a man who spent his life walking mountainous terrain at high altitude, and scans of his body revealed old healed fractures, evidence of previous injuries he had already survived earlier in his life, alongside indications of considerable long-standing physical wear, consistent with a life of hard, sustained labour. In other words, the man who died on that mountainside was not simply a healthy individual struck down suddenly by violence alone. He was a person already carrying multiple simultaneous burdens, an active infection working quietly through his system, parasites drawing on his physical reserves, and the accumulated wear of roughly 45 years of difficult, physically demanding life when the arrow finally struck. Is it possible that a healthier man, uncompromised by everything already working against him, might have survived that same wound, or at least survived it long enough to receive whatever help existed in his community? We cannot know for certain, and this remains one of the genuinely open questions surrounding his death, but the layered nature of what ultimately killed him offers a strikingly honest picture of how death in the ancient world actually tended to work. Rarely a single clean cause. Far more often, several vulnerabilities converging at once, each one compounding the others until the body simply could no longer absorb any further strain. There is a detail here that deserves particular attention because it reframes something easy to misunderstand about a man discovered frozen and alone on a remote mountainside. Ötzi was not poorly equipped or unprepared for the environment he found himself in. Quite the opposite. His clothing and equipment, recovered alongside his body in remarkable condition, reveal a level of sophistication that genuinely surprised researchers when first properly analysed. He wore a woven grass cloak for insulation, a coat and leggings crafted from carefully prepared animal hide, and shoes constructed with a level of engineering that modern outdoor equipment designers have studied with real professional interest. Waterproof bearskin soles paired with a deer hide, upper insulated with soft grass packed inside for warmth in a design remarkably similar in principle to modern winter boots. He carried a copper axe, an object of genuine value and status in his era, along with a small emergency kit containing tinder fungus for starting fire and what researchers believe were medicinal preparations, including a particular type of fungus known to have mild antibiotic and antiparasitic properties, which he may have been using consciously or through inherited practical knowledge to manage the very intestinal parasites his remains later confirmed he was carrying. This is a person, in other words, who understood his environment deeply, who carried tools reflecting real accumulated knowledge about survival, illness, and the practical demands of life at high altitude. And still, none of that preparation, none of that accumulated wisdom proved sufficient against the specific combination of circumstances that ultimately caught up with him on that particular day. There is something worth sitting with in that fact, a reminder that skill and knowledge, however considerable, could reduce risk in the ancient world, but could never fully eliminate it. The margin between survival and death remained narrow even for the most capable, most prepared individuals this era produced. Remarkable as it is, still leaves an important part of this narrative unfinished, because his remains tell us primarily about death, about the precise layered way one particular life came to its end on a mountainside 5,000 years ago. there is another discovery made decades earlier in a very different landscape that tells us something quite different and in some ways considerably more moving. It concerns not how a person died, but how, against every reasonable expectation, one particular person managed to survive an injury that by any honest measure should have ended his life immediately. In 1957, in a cave nestled into the mountains of northern Iraq, a team of archaeologists led by Ralph Solecki uncovers a set of Neanderthal remains that will go on to reshape how an entire field understands a species long dismissed at the time as brutish and simple. The skeleton, later designated Shanida 1, belongs to a man who died somewhere between 40 and 50,000 years ago, at what researchers estimate was an age of roughly 40, elderly by the standards of his time and his species. What makes his remains so remarkable is not that he died. It is everything his bones reveal about the extraordinary length of time he managed to survive before that death finally arrived. His skeleton tells a story of accumulated severe trauma, almost difficult to comprehend as belonging to a single individual. His right arm shows evidence of having been amputated or possibly lost through injury well above the elbow. The bone healed cleanly enough to suggest he lived for years, quite possibly decades, without the use of that limb entirely. His right eye socket shows damage consistent with a blow severe enough to have caused blindness on that side, healed long before his death. His legs show evidence of significant chronic degeneration changes to the bone, consistent with the pronounced and lasting limp that would have made walking, particularly across the uneven rocky terrain surrounding his cave, difficult and painful for a considerable portion of his adult life. Researchers examining his remains have also identified evidence suggesting significant hearing loss, likely affecting one or both ears, adding yet another layer of disability to an already extraordinary accumulation of injury. Consider what this actually means, laid out plainly. Here is a man missing an arm, blind in one eye, walking with a severe and lasting impairment, likely struggling to hear clearly, living in an era defined by physically demanding daily survival hunting, large and dangerous animals traveling across difficult terrain, competing directly with the natural world for every resource his continued existence required. By any reasonable measure applied to that kind of environment, a person carrying this combination of injuries should not have survived more than a matter of weeks, unable to hunt, unable to defend himself effectively, unable to keep pace with a group that depended on mobility and physical capability for its own collective survival. And yet the evidence embedded directly in his bones confirms without ambiguity that he lived for years afterward, quite possibly for a decade or more beyond whatever catastrophic event first caused this cascade of injury. This discovery, when it was first properly analysed and published, genuinely startled the archaeological community, and it is worth understanding why, because the shift in perspective it caused runs far deeper than a single interesting skeleton. For much of the earlier 20th century, Neanderthals were widely portrayed both within serious academic circles and in popular imagination as primitive, brutish, and fundamentally lacking in the kind of complex social behaviour long assumed to be uniquely human. Shanida 1 complicated that picture almost immediately and irreversibly. A man this severely disabled could not have survived through his own physical capability alone. His continued existence necessarily required sustained help from others, people willing to share food with him when he could not hunt for himself, to support him across difficult terrain when his own damaged leg could not reliably carry him, to protect him during a period of vulnerability that by any conventional measure of prehistoric survival logic should have made him an unsustainable burden on the group around him. Ralph Solecki, reflecting on this discovery, famously suggested it offered direct evidence of compassion among Neanderthals, care extended not out of calculated necessity, but out of something closer to genuine sustained concern for a member of the group who could offer little in return. This interpretation captured enormous public attention at the time, and it remains in broad strokes the interpretation most commonly associated with Shanidar 1 even now. It is worth being honest, however, about how the conversation among researchers has evolved since that initial excitement, because the picture, as is so often true in this field, has grown more nuanced rather than simpler with additional study. Some more recent scholarship has pushed back gently against the most romantic framing of this discovery, noting that survival with these particular injuries, while certainly requiring considerable support, may not have demanded quite as much constant dedicated care as originally assumed. A one-arm, partially blind man with a significant limp, some researchers argue, could still have contributed meaningfully to group survival in ways that did not require full physical capability. Processing hides working stone tools with his remaining hand sharing. Knowledge accumulated across decades of lived experience that younger, more able-bodied members of the group had not yet had the opportunity to acquire. Scholars still debate genuinely and without easy resolution exactly how much of Shanidar 1's survival reflects pure selfless compassion and how much reflects a more complicated calculation, one where care for the injured coexisted comfortably alongside practical recognition of what an experienced elder could still offer a group, even with a body that had been fundamentally altered by injury. Perhaps, though, this distinction matters less than it initially appears to. Whether the impulse to keep this man alive sprang from tenderness or utility, or more likely some inseparable combination of both, the outcome remains equally remarkable either way. A community of Neanderthals existing tens of thousands of years before recorded history, in an era popularly imagined as ruled entirely by brute survival instinct, made a sustained collective decision repeated daily across years to keep a severely disabled member of their group alive. That decision required real ongoing sacrifice, food redirected that could have gone elsewhere, pace slowed to accommodate his limitations, protection extended during moments of genuine vulnerability, whatever combination of motives lay behind it. The willingness to make that sacrifice at all tells us something enduring about the particular species we so recently and for so long underestimated. There is one further detail from the broader excavation at Shanidar Cave worth including here, because it adds an unexpected and genuinely touching layer to this same story, even though it involves a separate individual entirely. Pollen analysis conducted on soil samples surrounding another burial at the same site initially suggested the presence of deliberately placed flowers, an interpretation that captured enormous public imagination for decades, offering a vivid image of Neanderthals conducting ritual burial with genuine emotional and even spiritual dimension. More recent research has complicated this particular interpretation considerably, suggesting the pollen may have been introduced through burrowing rodents rather than deliberate human placement, and the evidence remains genuinely unresolved either way. It stands as a useful reminder sitting alongside the far more solidly established evidence of Shanidar 1 survival that this field continues to revise itself honestly as new information emerges, holding its most evocative interpretations with appropriate humility, even when they are understandably the ones we most want to believe. What both of these threads from the same remarkable cave leave us with taken together is a picture considerably richer and more complicated than the story of ancient danger told in isolation. Injury, illness, and death were constant genuine threats throughout this period, exactly as this account has followed in careful detail. But surrounding those threats consistently enough to leave clear evidence across tens of thousands of years and multiple different human species entirely was something else as well, a willingness, however complicated its underlying motives, to fight for the survival of those who could not fight fully for themselves. And it is worth asking gently what it actually took in a world already stretched thin by its own daily demands for a group to look at someone who had lost so much and decide again and again across years that his life remained worth the considerable cost of preserving it. The question of why some ancient people survived injuries and illnesses that should have killed them while others died from wounds that seem by comparison almost trivial has occupied researchers for decades, and it turns out to be a considerably more complicated question than it first appears. It would be comforting to imagine a simple hierarchy of danger, certain injuries always fatal, others always survivable, a clear and predictable logic underlying who lived and who did not. The evidence, the more closely it is examined, refuses to support anything quite that tidy. Part of what makes this question so difficult involves a problem researchers in this field have come to call somewhat wryly the osteological paradox, and understanding it changes how this entire story should be read in retrospect. The problem is this. The skeletons available for study are by definition the remains of people who died. A person who suffered a minor infection and recovered completely within a matter of weeks leaves no lasting mark on their bones at all and vanishes from the archaeological record as anything other than an ordinary healthy individual. A person whose infection spread into bone before their immune system eventually won that fight leaves behind a visible scar, a permanent record of a battle they survived. And a person who succumbed entirely leaves behind evidence of a battle they lost. This means that when researchers look across a large collection of ancient remains and see extensive evidence of disease and injury, that evidence counterintuitively does not necessarily indicate a uniquely dangerous or unhealthy population. In some cases, it may actually indicate the opposite, a population resilient enough that its members frequently survived long enough for illness to leave a visible mark on bone in the first place, rather than dying too quickly for any such record to form at all. Scholars still debate exactly how significantly this paradox should reshape our broader interpretation of ancient health, and the honest answer is that it varies considerably depending on which specific population and which specific time period is under discussion. What it does confirm with reasonable certainty is that reading skeletal evidence requires far more care and nuance than simply counting visible pathologies and assuming more equals worse. A heavily scarred skeleton might represent someone whose body fought valiantly and repeatedly against genuine threats and won each time, right up until the encounter that finally proved too much. It is in its own strange way a kind of evidence for resilience as much as vulnerability, and untangling which interpretation applies to any specific case remains one of the more genuinely contested methodological challenges within the entire field. This uncertainty extends into a related and equally significant debate, one concerning how long people in this period actually tended to live, a question that sounds simple but has proven remarkably resistant to easy answers. Popular understanding for much of the past century held that prehistoric life expectancy hovered somewhere in the range of 30 years, a figure repeated so often across textbooks and documentaries that it settled into something close to accepted fact. More careful demographic analysis in recent decades has complicated this considerably, and the complication itself contains a genuinely surprising detail. That low average figure researchers now widely agree was driven overwhelmingly by extremely high rates of infant and childhood mortality deaths that pulled the overall average down dramatically, rather than reflecting the typical lifespan of someone who managed to survive childhood's particular gauntlet of dangers. A person who reached the age of 15 in most ancient populations studied in careful demographic depth had a genuinely reasonable chance of living into their 50s or even 60s, a figure that surprises many people encountering it for the first time, given how thoroughly the much lower average has embedded itself in popular imagination. This distinction matters enormously for how this entire story should be understood in its final shape. The dangers explored across this account, infected wounds, broken bones, difficult childbirth, dental abscesses, were genuinely severe and genuinely capable of ending a life at any age. but they existed within populations where a meaningful number of people also lived long, full lives, accumulating decades of experience raising grandchildren, passing down exactly the kind of practical medical knowledge, wound care, splinting herbal treatment that this story has traced throughout. Survival was neither guaranteed nor impossible. It existed in a genuinely uncertain space between those two extremes, shaped by a combination of the specific injury or illness involved, the resources and knowledge available to the group surrounding the affected person, and in ways that remain frustratingly difficult to fully quantify even now, a considerable measure of simple, unpredictable chance. There is another layer of debate worth including here, because it touches directly on something already explored through both Shanida 1 and the Borneo amputation, and it concerns exactly how widespread genuine medical care actually was across different ancient populations, rather than representing isolated, exceptional cases. Some researchers argue that discoveries like these, while genuinely remarkable, should be understood as exceptions rather than evidence of universal practice, extraordinary examples that survive specifically because they were extraordinary, while countless more ordinary instances of care tending a fever, setting a simple fracture, sitting beside someone through a difficult night, left no lasting physical evidence at all, and are therefore permanently invisible to the archaeological record. Other researchers push back against this framing, suggesting that the sheer frequency of healed injuries appearing across skeletal populations worldwide, not just in a handful of famous, well-publicized cases, indicates that this kind of sustained care was closer to a consistent norm than a rare exception deeply woven into how most ancient human groups actually function day to day. Is it possible that both interpretations hold true simultaneously, depending on which population, which era, which specific set of environmental pressures shaped a given group's capacity to support its injured and its sick? The evidence increasingly suggests exactly that, a considerably more varied and locally specific picture than any single sweeping narrative about ancient care, whether optimistic or grim, can fully capture on its own. Some groups, blessed with relatively stable resources and predictable seasonal patterns, likely extended more consistent, elaborate care to their vulnerable members. Others, pushed to the edge by marginal environments or unpredictable scarcity, almost certainly faced harder choices that left less room for the kind of sustained, costly support that kept a man like Shanida 1 alive for years after injuries that should have ended his life immediately. What emerges from sitting with all of this together? The osteological paradox, the genuine complexity behind ancient life expectancy, and the honest, ongoing scholarly disagreement about how consistently care was extended to the injured is not a single clean answer to the question of why some people survived and others did not. It is instead a picture considerably closer to how survival actually tends to work in any era, including our own. A combination of factors, some biological, some social, some environmental, and some simply irreducibly a matter of chance, converging differently in every individual case, producing outcomes that resist easy generalization even after decades of careful, dedicated study. There is one final piece of this puzzle worth including, because it reframes the entire question in a way that feels particularly relevant to how this story began. Researchers studying contemporary populations that still practice something closer to a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle, though it would be a mistake to treat these groups as perfect, unchanged windows into the deep past, have noted a consistent pattern that appears to hold across remarkably different cultures and environments. Groups with stronger social cohesion, more consistent sharing of food and resources, and more deeply embedded traditions of caring for the sick and injured tend to show measurably better survival outcomes following serious illness or injury than groups facing similar environmental pressures with weaker social bonds. This pattern, cautiously extrapolated backward into deep prehistory, suggests something worth sitting with as this story moves toward its close. The tiny mistake at the center of this entire account, the cut, the fracture, the difficult birth, was never really the whole story on its own. What often determined whether that mistake proved fatal or survivable was not the injury itself, but the strength and willingness of the people surrounding the person who carried it. That idea, quiet and unassuming as it sounds, may be the truest thread running beneath everything this story has followed so far, and it deserves one final careful look before this particular journey through the deep past comes to its close. What emerges most clearly once the individual threads of this story are drawn together is that the constant presence of small, potentially fatal danger did not simply happen to early human societies. It shaped them quietly and persistently across a span of time so long that its influence settled into the deepest structures of how human groups came to organize themselves, cooperate with one another, and eventually understand the very concept of healing. Consider for a moment what a society built around this particular vulnerability actually required of its members once care for the injured and the sick moved beyond occasional instinct and became something closer to expected practice. It required specific knowledge which plants reduced swelling, which preparations seemed to slow bleeding, which signs suggested a wound was healing versus a wound that was quietly turning dangerous. This knowledge did not simply exist in the abstract. It had to live somewhere, carried inside the memory of specific people, refined across years of direct hands-on experience and passed forward deliberately to those who would eventually need to carry it themselves. In many ancient societies, this role appears to have concentrated gradually into recognizable positions of specialized knowledge. Early healers, sometimes overlapping with spiritual or ritual authority, sometimes distinct from it, whose accumulated expertise in wound care and illness made them genuinely valuable to the survival of the entire group. There is a particular category of archaeological evidence that illustrates just how far this specialized medical knowledge had developed, even in periods we tend to imagine as almost entirely without formal medical practice, and it involves one of the more startling procedures recovered from the deep past: trepanation. The deliberate creation of a hole in the skull through cutting, scraping or drilling appears at sites scattered across the ancient world, from Europe to South America to parts of Africa, dating back in some confirmed cases more than 7,000 years. What makes this evidence genuinely remarkable is not simply that the procedure occurred, but what the healed bones surrounding many of these openings reveals. A significant proportion in some excavated populations, reaching well over half of all examined cases, show clear evidence of new bone growth around the edges of the opening, meaning the patient did not merely undergo this extraordinarily invasive procedure, they survived it often for a considerable period afterward. Think carefully about what that fact actually implies. Someone working with tools would look primitive by any modern surgical standard deliberately opened another person's skull and did so with enough understanding of anatomy, enough control over bleeding, and enough attentiveness to subsequent wound care that the majority of these patients lived to see the wound close and the bone begin healing around it. Scholars still debate precisely why this procedure was performed with such apparent frequency across so many unconnected cultures, whether to relieve pressure following head trauma, to treat what were likely interpreted as seizures or severe headaches, or in some cases for reasons more closely tied to ritual and belief than to anything we would today recognize as strictly medical necessity. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete on this particular question, and it likely always will, since the motivations behind an ancient procedure like this rarely survive alongside the physical evidence of the procedure itself. What is not in question, however, is the skill involved and the survival rate documented across these skeletal remains, stands as one of the more quietly astonishing testaments to how sophisticated ancient medical practice had genuinely become developed entirely without the benefit of germ theory, anesthesia, or any of the tools modern medicine now considers absolutely essential. This accumulated knowledge did not remain static either. It moved adapted, and in some traceable cases appears to have spread between groups that had little other cultural contact, carried along trade routes and migration paths alongside more obviously valuable goods like flint shell and worked stone. Certain plant remedies, yarrow prominent among them, appear in archaeological contexts across an enormous geographic range, suggesting either remarkably similar independent discovery occurring again and again in unconnected populations, or perhaps more likely in at least some cases, the gradual transmission of practical medical knowledge alongside the more commonly studied exchange of material goods. It is a reminder worth holding on to that even in a world without writing, without any formal system for recording and transmitting information across distance, knowledge that mattered enough to human survival still found ways to travel. There is a deeper, more biological layer to this story as well, one that extends the consequences of this constant low-grade danger beyond culture and knowledge into the very genetic makeup of the human species itself. The relentless repeated pressure of infection across tens of thousands of years appears to have exerted genuine measurable influence on human evolution, favoring certain immune system variations capable of responding more effectively to the specific bacterial threats our ancestors most commonly encountered. Researchers studying human genetic diversity have identified regions of our genome, particularly those governing immune response, that show unusually strong signatures of historical selective pressure, evidence essentially of our ancestors' immune systems being tested repeatedly, generation after generation, by exactly the kind of wound infections and illnesses this story has followed, in such close detail. In a very real biological sense, the danger explored throughout this entire account did not simply threaten individual lives. It shaped in small but measurable ways what the human immune system itself eventually became, a lasting genetic inheritance passed down from countless ordinary people whose individual names and stories have long since been lost, but whose bodies, in survival, what they survived quietly influenced the biological toolkit every person alive today still carries. And what of the social consequences beyond medicine and beyond genetics? It is worth returning one final time to the pattern already touched on earlier in this story, the strong correlation researchers have observed between social cohesion and survival outcomes following serious injury or illness. If this pattern held true across deep prehistory and the accumulated evidence increasingly suggests it did, then the constant presence of this particular danger may have functioned as a genuine evolutionary pressure favoring cooperation itself, favoring groups willing to invest real costly effort into caring for injured and vulnerable members over groups less willing or less able to make that same investment. Is it possible then that something as intimate and specific as a splinter, a fever, a difficult birth contributed across an almost unimaginable span of accumulated time to shaping the deeply cooperative, socially bonded creatures human beings eventually became? The evidence cannot prove this with the certainty of a controlled experiment, since no such experiment could ever be run across tens of thousands of years of lived human history. But the pattern considered honestly and with appropriate caution points strongly in that direction, suggesting that our capacity for sustained costly compassion may be in part a direct legacy of exactly the kind of vulnerability this story has spent so much time exploring. There is something worth pausing on here, a kind of quiet symmetry running underneath everything this account has followed. The danger was real, and it was constant, threatening nearly every person who ever lived before the development of modern medicine. Threatening them not through dramatic battle or sweeping catastrophe, but through the smallest, most ordinary moments imaginable, a cut, a scrape, a labour that did not proceed as expected. And yet that very danger, repeated across countless individual lives and an almost incomprehensible stretch of time, appears to have helped forge the very qualities that make us most recognizably, movingly human. The willingness to sit beside someone through a difficult night. The instinct to press a healing plant against an open wound even without understanding why it worked. The decision made again and again across tens of thousands of years to keep a severely injured person alive, not because doing so was easy or without cost, but because something deep within the structure of human social life had come to insist that it mattered. This is where the story of any single wound, any single fracture, any single difficult birth finally widens into something considerably larger than the individual moment it began with. Because the tiny mistake at the center of this entire account was never really about the mistake itself. It was about everything that gathered around it afterward. The knowledge accumulated to treat it, the hands that reached out to help the community that decided over and over, across an almost unimaginable stretch of human history, that even the smallest and most vulnerable life among them remained worth the considerable effort required to save it. What remains now is only to return one final time to where this story began, beside a quiet river in the presence of a single ordinary wound, and to see what that story and everything it eventually came to represent ultimately leaves behind. Return for a moment to her, the woman beside the river whose hand closed around a stone that was sharper than it looked on an afternoon so ordinary that no one nearby thought to remember it. We have spent this entire story with her and with the countless others, like her, scattered across an almost incomprehensible span of human time, because her injury was never really about her alone. It was a doorway into something far larger, a way of understanding an entire hidden dimension of human history that rarely receives the attention given to wars, to empires, to the dramatic collapses that usually populate our stories about the deep past. What we have traced together across these hours is a different kind of history entirely. Not the history of armies clashing or civilizations rising and falling in dramatic visible arcs, but the quieter, more intimate history of the human body itself, negotiating its survival against threats too small to seem significant in the moment they occurred. A splinter, a scratch, a tooth left aching too long, a bone that gave way beneath an ordinary footstep, a birth that unfolded exactly as thousands of births had unfolded before it until without warning it did not. These were never the stories that made it into legend or myth, passed down through generations as tales of glory or tragedy worth remembering by name. They were simply what life was for nearly the entire span of human existence. A constant quiet negotiation with a body that could turn against itself at any moment for reasons no one around it could see or fully understand. And yet, as we have followed this story closely, something else has revealed itself. Alongside the danger, something that complicates any simple narrative about how brutal, how precarious, how frightening this era of human life actually was. Because surrounding every one of these small catastrophes we have found evidence consistent and repeated across continents and thousands of years of people refusing to simply let that danger run its course unopposed. Hands crushing yarrow between stones, splints crafted from bark and hide, a community in Borneo willing to carry a young person through years of recovery after an amputation that should have ended in death within days. A group in what is now northern Iraq choosing over and over across a decade or more to keep a man alive who had lost an arm, an eye, and much of his ability to walk because something in the structure of their shared life together insisted that his continued existence mattered. This is where the story of the tiny mistake becomes something considerably larger than its title initially suggests. Because the mistake itself, the cut, the fracture, the difficult labor was never really the point. The point was always what gathered around it afterward. The point was the hands that reached out. The knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next without ever being written down. The decisions made again and again, across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, to fight for a single vulnerable life, even when the immediate practical logic of survival might have suggested walking away instead. Ötzi's remains tell us something honest about the limits of that fight. Even a man carrying real knowledge, real preparation, real medicine, tucked carefully into a pouch at his side, could still be brought down by a convergence of threats too numerous and too severe for any single body to withstand. His death was not a failure of effort or understanding. It was simply the honest, unforgiving mathematics of a world where danger rarely arrived alone, where an infection could compound an old injury, where a parasite could quietly draw down the reserves a body needed to survive a sudden, violent encounter it never saw coming. His frozen body, discovered by two hikers who had no idea what they were about to find, offers us something rare and valuable, not a tragedy to mourn, from a comfortable distance, but a genuinely intimate window into exactly how precarious survival remained even for someone as capable and prepared as he clearly was. And Shanidar 1 offers us the opposite lesson, equally honest, equally important, that even against overwhelming odds, even carrying injuries that should have ended a life within days, survival remained possible when a community decided collectively and repeatedly that it would be. Neither of these stories cancels the other out. They exist together side by side exactly as danger and care existed together throughout this entire period of human history, inseparable from one another, each one incomplete without the other standing beside it. What connects all of this in the end to something larger than any single skeleton or any single ancient injury is a truth that reaches forward across the entire distance separating that world from our own. We tend to imagine progress as something linear medicine advancing steadily from ignorance toward understanding danger, receding gradually as knowledge accumulates. And in many respects, that is exactly what happened. We now understand what those ancient healers could only sense through pattern and instinct, the invisible organisms responsible for infection, the biological mechanics of fever and immune response, the precise reasons certain plants seemed to help while others did nothing at all. We have tools now, antibiotics, sterile instruments, surgical technique refined across centuries of accumulated medical science, that would have seemed like something closer to magic to the people whose lives we have followed throughout this story. But it is worth remembering gently and without alarm that the fundamental vulnerability underneath all of this progress has never actually disappeared. It has only been pushed back, held at a safer distance than it once occupied. The same infection that could have killed the woman beside the river remains in principle entirely capable of killing a person today if left long enough, without the intervention that modern medicine now makes so quietly, so reliably available that most of us rarely think about it at all. The same bleeding that threatened a mother in an ancient river valley still threatens mothers today in parts of the world where that same modern intervention remains difficult to access. The line separating danger from safety has moved considerably in our favor across the centuries, but it has never fully disappeared. And understanding this deep history, understanding exactly how thin that line once was for absolutely everyone who ever lived before us, offers a particular kind of gratitude that is difficult to arrive at any other way. There is one final piece of evidence worth including here, discovered not in Europe or the Alps, or the mountains of Iraq, but in a burial site in what is now the Czech Republic, dating back roughly 26,000 years, that crystallizes something this entire story has been quietly building toward. The remains belong to a young man who lived with the genetic condition causing severe physical deformity throughout much of his skeleton. A condition that would have made walking difficult, made physical labor of almost any kind a genuine daily struggle from the earliest years of his life. And yet the evidence surrounding his remains shows no indication of neglect or exclusion. He was buried with the same care, the same attention, the same evident respect given to every other member of his community laid to rest at that same site. He had lived by every indication the evidence provides, not as an outsider tolerated at the margins of his group, but as a full and valued member of it for the entire span of a life that would have required sustained daily support from the people around him simply to continue. 26,000 years is a genuinely difficult distance to hold in the mind. And yet here at that distance, in a world we tend to imagine as governed entirely by harsh, unforgiving necessity, is evidence of a community choosing deliberately and consistently to make room for someone who could offer very little in the way of physical contribution, and choosing to honour that same person fully and without qualification in the manner of his burial once his life had ended. Whatever this era was, and it was genuinely dangerous, genuinely unforgiving in ways this story has not tried to soften or hide, it was also apparently capable of this, of care extended without guarantee of return, of value placed on a life for reasons that had nothing to do with strength or usefulness in any narrow practical sense. That is not a comfortable, tidy resolution to a story built almost entirely around danger and fragility. It does not erase what came before it, the infected wounds, the broken bones that never healed, the mothers and children buried together in the same quiet grave. But it sits alongside all of that true in exactly the same way, and it offers something worth carrying forward as this story finally comes to rest. The past was in every honest sense this account has tried to preserve genuinely brutal. It offered no guarantees, no safety nets, no assurance that a life carefully lived would be a life that continued. A single afternoon, a single misplaced step, a single moment when a hand met stone slightly wrong could end everything a person had built, everything they had hoped to become. This was true for the woman beside the river. It was true for the man found frozen in the ice. It was true for every person whose bones now rest quietly in the earth, waiting patiently for someone willing to listen to what they still have to say. And still across all of that danger, across every single mistake this story has followed, with such close and careful attention, something else persisted as well. Something quieter than danger, but no less real. People noticed each other's pain. People reached toward it imperfectly, without guarantee of success, without any framework beyond instinct and accumulated experience to guide them. A hand pressed gently against a fevered forehead. A splint carefully bound around a shattered limb. A community choosing day after day for years to keep someone alive who had lost almost everything except the simple fact of being loved. That is what remains in the end when everything else about this story settles into stillness. Not only the wound, not only the danger it carried silent and patient beneath the surface of an ordinary afternoon, but also the hand that reached toward it. The quiet, unbroken thread of care running underneath all of it, connecting a woman beside a river to a man frozen in ice. To a community in a cave that would not let go of one of their own, to every mother, every father, every stranger who ever knelt beside someone hurting and chose without being asked to stay. We carry that thread still. It runs through every hospital room, every quiet act of care extended to someone who cannot repay it, every hand that reaches instinctively toward another person's pain. It began long before written history could record it. It began perhaps exactly where this story did, beside a fire, beside a river, beside someone hurt and someone else choosing to stay close. The night around her deepens now the fire burned down to its last quiet embers. Her hand has healed. The scar remains faint and pale against her palm, a small mark she will carry for the rest of her life, though she will rarely think of it and never know the particular danger it once represented. Somewhere nearby, someone shifts closer to the warmth, unaware of anything remarkable in the moment. It is only an ordinary night, the kind that fills nearly all of a life unremembered, unremarkable, simply lived, and that in the end is the quiet miracle underneath everything this story has followed. Not the famous deaths, not the dramatic discoveries frozen in ice or buried in stone, but this, an ordinary night, a healed hand, A fire burning low with someone still breathing beside it. The river moves on into darkness the way it always has. Somewhere it still does.